Hi everyone, my name is Daniel Hanks, and today I'm going to be talking to you about systematic spatial conservation planning. There are multiple tools that we use in conservation planning that incorporate our understanding of ecological systems and operate within the constraints of our socio-political systems. Systematic spatial conservation planning is just one of those many tools that conservationists use to accomplish their goals. So what is systematic spatial conservation planning, and why is it needed? Systematic spatial conservation planning is a quantitative approach to systematically assess potential conservation actions and provide informed decision-making power to the stakeholders. It is needed because ecological patterns and processes occur at and are being impacted at the landscape scale. It helps us achieve our conservation goals while considering the threats that can hinder those goals. Collaborative input from a variety of stakeholders is a hallmark of systematic spatial conservation planning, and a key factor that sets it apart from other conservation planning approaches is that it uses mathematical solutions to find optimal spatial configurations to complex spatial problems. The overall goal of systematic spatial conservation planning is to provide a system of managed and protected areas which are representative of socio-ecologically important ecosystems, cultural resources, and ecological processes, all while considering that the future is both dynamic and uncertain. Including all aspects of our conservation goals across space and time is a complex and difficult task. We use the word care to help us remember the fundamental principles for systematic spatial conservation plan. In doing so, we hope to protect biodiversity, the livelihoods of people who depend on biodiversity, and a specific quality of life. A plan that adheres to the care principle is connected, adequate, representative, and efficient. A connected plan allows species to travel unimpeded, or relatively so, across the landscape to ensure long-term persistence of the full range of a species' habitat needs. In other words, it allows biophysical processes and habitat requirements for a variety of species' different life stages to be linked across the landscape. An adequate plan provides enough protection of species and their required habitats to ensure their persistence through time. A representative plan captures and protects all of the species and habitats present and further ensures this by including their spatial replication. And finally, in an efficient plan, all locations taken together achieve the goals with the least cost, thereby reducing the impact on people while meeting the objectives of the other three components. Now let us take a look at an example. If we consider a hypothetical example where we are interested in the conservation of an aquatic system, you see that we have a single target, suitable spawning substrate, and protected riparian areas all along a stream network. In conservation planning, we need to break the landscape up into some definable spatial unit. Here, you see hexagons, but this can also be represented by watersheds, for example. So in the example here, we have 24 planning units, 1 target species, and 3 habitat requirements. Now let's take a look at the spatial relationships of our species and physical habitat. You'll notice in the upper section that in the headwaters there is a suitable riparian areas and substrate, but the downstream dam acts as a barrier to the connectivity of required habitat for the fish species we are interested in protecting. In the lower portion of the figure, you'll notice that there seems to be no barrier to fish movement into the headwaters where spawning substrate is located. There is an agricultural facility that could act as a barrier due to possible runoff, but the riparian area is protected, and so in this hypothetical example, it does not act as a barrier to fish migration. Whereas in the upper portion of the figure, you will see a planning unit with an agricultural facility and with no riparian protection, resulting in fish being unable to make their way to the next planning unit, regardless of there being a dam there. So what should we protect? It seems reasonable that we should protect the lower stream section that connects all of our biophysical requirements for the simple aquatic example. But what happens if we begin to add other targets? So now consider an example with 4 targets. You can see that it becomes a much more complex planning situation. Recall that adequate means that we need enough of each species and habitat type to ensure their long-term success. Here, we should also consider potential impacts from stresses such as land use and land use change and climate change. Remember, we want to maintain connectivity for our aquatic target and associated habitat requirements. Additionally, for our plan to be adequate, we now need enough of each species and habitat to ensure their long-term success. This requires a good knowledge of the spatial requirements for all of these targets. You will notice that in our connected aquatic plan, the planning units already contain some representation of the other targets. Maybe we could start by simply looking at the number of targets represented in each planning unit. What if we decided to protect the planning units with 3 or greater targets? This example shows only adequacy in terms of species being represented within the planning unit. However, it does not indicate if their habitat requirements are needed, nor does it consider connectivity. What if the bird target we were to be an endangered species? We probably want to consider conserving all of the planting units where it is known to occur. Now that our plan seems to be connected and adequate, we want to ensure that all species and habitats that are present in the planning region are represented and spatially replicated. So in addition to the current area proposed to be protected, we need to ensure the special bog habitat in the upper right of the region of the screen is also conserved. Because of the future being uncertain and unpredictable, this spatial replication that is built into the plan, where species and habitats are replicated in more than one planning unit, helps protect against various forms of disturbance and catastrophe. For example, natural disasters or changes in land use that can be catastrophic for our conservation plan are mitigated against by this spatial replication. In the example here, we lost one of our bog habitats to a natural disaster and 2 planting units with our endangered bird species were lost to development. However, each have been spatially replicated and so they can persist within the region. At this point, we need to work towards minimizing impacts of our conservation plan that has on people and try to mitigate potential conflicts that can arise between livelihoods and conservation, including those livelihoods that depend on conserved biodiversity. We need a spatial plan that is efficient. For example, we might want to consider providing space in our plan for a neighborhood near the recently developed urban area. Additionally, due to limited conservation funds, we might want to consider removing from our plan 2 of the protected planting units where our protected bird species is found. Due to our spatial replication, however, we still provide protection to nearly 70% of the planting units with our endangered bird species. Our plan is now connected, adequate, representative, and efficient. Let's now take a look at another example where your job is to identify the smallest number of planting units while conserving all of the identified targets. In this simple example, by ensuring all targets are met, we are being representative, and by selecting the fewest number of targets, we are being efficient. I'll give you 10 seconds to come up with a solution. It might seem sensible to select the planting unit with the most targets represented, which would be planting unit 1 with 8 targets. In doing so, however, you'll notice that there are 2 targets yet to be protected, the gopher frog and the eastern diamondback. To protect these 2 targets, you will also need to select planting units 3 and 5. This is often the result of spatial overlay models where the spatial unit with the most targets or layers is prioritized. However, recall that we are trying also to be good stewards of our conservation resources. So, greedy is not good. You will now notice that if we selected planting units 3 and 5, and while each only has a total of 5 targets, we reach our representative plan while being much more efficient. The examples I've shown in the presentation are all simple examples, but the difficulties become apparent when you start to consider a large spatial extent and many more targets. In the plans that you will see presented hereafter for the Congaree Biosphere Reserve, there were as many as 7,901 planting units and 11 integrated features and targets. Because of the exponential increase in complexity with additional planting units and targets, we rely on computer software programs such as MarkSand aimed at creating a spatial plan that is connected, adequate, representative, and efficient.